I'm pretty sure that most of you have played at least one or two video games throughout your life. Some of those games might have had some violence in them. However, I dare to say that you can be able to differentiate something that is virtual from your reality. Hello, my name is Felipe, and today I'll convince you that video games do not encourage players to become violent in real life. For that, we first need to know why video games are to blame as the cause of violence. Then I'll talk about a few studies that found no relationship between virtual violence and real life violence. And lastly, I'll talk of how video games actually affect people. So let's start by explaining why video games are to blame. Video games have been blamed constantly of mass shootings and other violent crimes. Mainly, these have happened out of comments from politicians and other people mentioning video games as the cause of these people's violence. Like Trump after two mass shootings in Texas and Ohio in August last year. An article from the New York Times cited a comment from him about these events. We must stop glorification of violence in our society, including the gruesome video games that are now commonplace, he said. Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, in the show Fox and Friends, also referred to the subject of mass shooting, saying the government should do something about video games. Fortunately, courts and policymakers only act upon evidence and research, and politicians have never provided actual proof that there is real life violence caused by violent games. James Ivory is the research director at Virginia Tech. He has researched about the social and psychological effects of video games. He has been determined that video games are not really a cause of violence. He instead named several strong predictors of violent crime, such as poverty, substance abuse, and child abuse. In an article from the CBS News, he mentioned that the public is 8 times more likely to blame crime on video games when the perpetrator is white, although white people don't play video games more than people of color, he said. So relating video games with white criminals is just a baseless excuse. However, there is actual studies that prove there's no relationship between violent games and real-life violence, which brings us to my second point. In a study conducted by the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, headquartered in Germany, they took 90 teenagers and divided them into 3 groups, having active, passive, and no exposure at all to video games. After 2 months, they did a few psychological tests and they noticed no difference among the individuals. Therefore, their conclusion was that there's no link between violent video games and aggression in teenagers. An article from the Psychology Today magazine from Andrew Frischman, he talks about some other examples of experiments. In one, researchers created 2 first-person shooter games with different levels of violence. In the violent game, characters would suffer horrific, bloody deaths. The other was a paintball game in which characters simply disappeared when they were shot. The 2 games were otherwise identical. When they tested the levels of aggression afterward, they found no differences between the groups. Another study was proof of this as well. 2 groups of people had to play Tetris, but the game was manipulated to be harder for one group. At the end, the group playing more complicated and frustrating versions of the game showed more aggression afterward. Now you might wonder what role video games play on our behavior. So in my third point, I will talk about how video games actually affect people. Andrew Fishman also talked about studies that go against video games. He said, in most of these studies, people compare games that were completely different, so the results didn't really prove their point. He argues that if we assume the differences on aggression were due to the difference in violence level, we would be ignoring several variables. So if it is not violence, what is it? He realized how other factors affect people, like the level of difficulty to play the game and the level of competition. According to him and his experiments, many people had aggressive thoughts simply because they lost in the game. And the other factor, which is competition, might be even obvious for most people. Whenever we're competing, even at Monopoly, we tend to have more aggressive thoughts if our opponents are beating us. In other words, these researchers conclude that game can make people angry just by being difficult to win. Therefore, it would be a mistake to relate aggressiveness directly with violence level in video games. If video games did indeed cause some mass shootings, one might expect events to be common in Japan or South Korea. Both countries spend more per capita on video games than the United States. But Japan and South Korea, both of which have very strict laws limiting gun ownership, have among the lowest rates of violent crime in the world. In conclusion, we can understand that playing video games does not lead to more violent behavior, based on recent studies and in failed attempts to hide the real problems of society. Now you know why some people tend to blame video games Although you also know how studies found no relationship between real life violence and violence in video games. And you can understand how people is actually affected by video games. It is really about time for video games to no longer be demonized as the cause for society's violent crimes. Playing video games does not make you a mass shooter.